Today we will be discussing standards as a critical piece to respond to the growing climate challenges. ISO, or the International Organization for Standardization, is the world's largest developer and publisher of international standards, and ISO has been leading development since 1947, and today manages over 300 committees with participation from 162 different countries around the world. ISO's proven standards development process ensures that all countries, both developed and developing, have a seat and a voice at the table. ISO standards are built through consensus and are a key tool for implementing sustainable development, not just theorizing about it. Today we can see that ISO standards are providing key insights into the emerging relationship between governments and industry when it comes to matters in the environment. Public expectations have greatly increased with regard to environmental matters, but governments simply cannot meet all of these expectations, and industry, through the use of ISO standards, has started to respond to this policy gap. ISO TC 268, for example, is developing global city indicators to spur action and reporting at the municipal level. TC 265 is generating a series of carbon capture and storage standards. And lastly, and probably most important to today's discussion, TC 207 SC7 has been developing all of ISO's keynote climate change standards, from GHG quantification and reporting to a new technical report on the carbon footprint of a product. All of these committees and the thousands of international experts behind their development are passionate about environmental action and have developed these important standards on a voluntary basis to support all end users implement meaningful actions to reduce environmental impacts and fill public policy gaps. Today we'll not only be talking about standards, but we'll be discussing how to take standards development one step further. And we will explore how to improve international collaboration. Collaboration to improve standards development by exploring opportunities to build synergies between the major standards development organizations. Thus, cooperation between the world's leading organizations to increase usability and, more importantly, reduce duplication is at the heart of today's discussion. We'll hear, obviously, from a range of speakers on this topic. First, we'll hear from Todd Delaney, Chairman of ISO's TMB Climate Change Coordination Committee. Todd will explain for us the current effort at ISO to build a robust climate change strategy. And then Tom Bauman, ISO TC 207 SC7 Chairman and co-founder of GHGMI, will then walk us through the SC7 strategic plan and outline specific opportunities for next generation standard systems. We will then take a deeper dive into some specific examples of ISO's new deliverables, which aim to build collaboration during development, such as the emerging line of climate change adaptation standards, and also ISO's new draft standard 14080, which provides guidance with framework and principles for methodologies on climate action. Owen Hewlett from the Gold Standard will then provide an overview of Gold Standard's meta standard, which will support stackable ecosystem goods and services to support sustainable development. And then finally, Joe Maddon will round out the discussion to provide key business perspectives on the road ahead for standards. We will conclude today's session with a short panel discussion to build on the presentations and openly discuss how increasing collaboration between standards bodies will decrease duplication and increase harmonization. As you can see, we have a packed agenda today, but our hope is that today's dialogue during these critical COP21 meetings will not only raise awareness about the important standards play, but will explore how we can move from today building lasting strategies to develop and raise awareness and move forward from today to increase global collaboration between ISO and all major standards development organizations. So first and foremost, Todd Delaney will provide us an overview. Todd has been an active member of the ISO community for more than 2 decades, participating in the development of ISO standards as a technical expert and or international coordinator. He's participated for ISO 1464 parts 1 and 2, ISO's 1465, 1466, and now most recently ISO 1467. He continues to speak at industry events worldwide on a variety of topics, including climate change adaptation, ISO standards, and hazardous waste. As the chairman of the Climate Change Coordination Committee, Todd brings an advanced understanding of climate change standards concerns across the globe, the development of climate change standards, ISO standards on climate change, and collaboration with key organizations and stakeholders on climate change initiatives and overall awareness. So Todd, over to you.
Thank you. Can you hear me on this one now? Yes? Yes? Okay, good. Okay, the overview of my presentation is that I'm going to talk a little bit about the International Standards Organization. I'm going to speak more about ISO's Climate Change Coordinating Committee that I chair, the mandate that we were given by the Technical Management Board of ISO's TMP, and the work completed to date, and what we're thinking are going to be our next steps going forward over the next 18 months to 2 years. As Michael has said a little bit, ISO is really the largest developer of voluntary international standards. There's 162 member countries from all regions of the earth, and it really strives to ensure consensus among stakeholders and the countries, facilitates participation of developing countries, and this has always been one of ISO's premium ideas in terms of how to get developing countries involved. So we do a lot of what we call twinning, where we'll have a developed country and then there will be a developing country that will also serve in some of the capacities in terms of the administration and direction of the standards development process. The ISO's Climate Change Coordinating Committee, this is something that the Technical Management Board, which is the management authority of ISO, set up in December of 2 years ago. It was set up so that they, being the Technical Management Board, could get feedback as to what is currently going on in regards to development of standards dealing with greenhouse gases, aerosols, adaptation, mitigation, and the various other areas associated with climate change. And so the direction for the committee that I run was that we had 14 experts that were chosen primarily by the Technical Management Board in order to sit on this. We had a 2-year mandate to essentially look at everything that ISO had been doing for the past 15 years that may result in something associated with climate change and how this was handled. One of the reasons that we're doing, that ISO wanted to do this, was that when we first started with CDM many years ago, ISO made an approach to the UNFCCC saying that, ISO could really help put together a program as to how you could do the validation verification work on carbon offsets. That didn't go anywhere. As we know, then the CDM was developed separately within the UNFCCC. What's happened now is that the UNFCCC has recognized that in order to implement a climate change program on a worldwide basis, they're not really going to be able to be in a position to run everything. So they're looking to cooperate with standards organizations, and one of the standards organizations that they're cooperating with is ISO. And in that realm, a lot of the work that we were doing in the Climate Change Coordinating Committee was with UNFCCC involvement and direct input, so that a lot of what we're trying to do in the new standards that we're looking at developing, that Chicago is going to talk about in terms of 1480, are really having a lot of input from the UN in terms of what their specific needs are and requirements may be, so that we can then incorporate that into the standards. So there's a lot closer relationship now than there has been in the past. And so our committee has 2 primary working groups, one on climate adaptation, the other on climate mitigation. 50% were external stakeholders and 50% of the committee that was ISO people like myself, not ISO employees, but people that work in the technical standards development side. It was established in December of 2014. I am the chair. Okay, what was we call ourselves the 4 Cs, so what was the 4 Cs mandate? It was to review existing standards and guidance related to climate change in those 2 specific areas of mitigation and adaptation. What we did in this is, as I said a little bit briefly, was we looked at all of the standards that have been developed over the last probably 5 to 10 years, but primarily since 2006 when we put together the ISO 14064 series of standards, to see what standards were out there and what the needs may be, knowing what the future is likely to require. And so I think we ended up with about 30 some odd standards within ISO that have something to do with climate change, and especially in the mitigation area. In the adaptation area, we didn't have any. So after our review, we assessed the needs and identified gaps for climate change standards and guidance. We've also developed proposals for future studies, and we've collaborated with key international organizations on climate change, i.e. the UNFCCC that I've mentioned previously. But one of the things that we also did was to work with a lot of other organizations, some of which are SEN, which is a European standard setting body. And one of the reasons why the coordinating committee, as we see a real need for it, is SEN right now is developing 3 adaptation standards for energy, buildings, and I can't remember the other one. But they're just in the initial stages of developing those standards. And that's something that really ISO needs to look at from the standpoint of if SEN is developing these standards, they really should become ISO standards also, and we should have some input into it. Prior to the coordinating committee being established, there wasn't any interaction between SEN necessarily and ISO. Now there is. We've also spoken with the World Bank, Gold Standard, BCS, WRI, WBCSD, in order to get input from these other organizations as to what do they see in terms of the needs for standards and what kind of a development schedule do they see a need to take place in. Whether it's work completed to date, we've identified areas for new standards, primarily in adaptation planning and vulnerability assessments. Part of the new work items that will be coming out will be in these 2 areas, and also in the general area of greenhouse gas management. Currently, the greenhouse gas standards 64, part 1s, 2, and 3 are currently undergoing revision, and we're trying to bring into that revision process new areas that need to be looked at. We've defined and engaged a number of stakeholders considering developing countries' viewpoints to see what needs they see that may be needed to come out so that we can incorporate that in the standards development. And we have established a close collaboration with the UNFCCC. In fact, we had a meeting in Bonn with, I think it was 5 members of the UN working specifically in the adaptation area, along with Michael and myself and one of the folks from Central Secretariat of ISO to try to work out more of an arrangement as to how we can go forward. Meeting lasted for about 4 hours, and I think all of us walked away feeling very good that we will be able to have a level of cooperation. I'm being told I have to hurry up, so I will hurry up. On this one, probably the most important part is that we submitted a set of overall recommendations to ISO TMB in July of this past year. We did have a 2-year mandate to do things, but things are moving so rapidly with regards to standards and standard needs that we felt that we should get our report in early. We've had some exchange with the folks from the TMB with regards to what they want us to do going forward, but it looks like we will probably be working for another 18 to 24 months to try to build on the work that we've do to ensure that the cooperation exists between ISO and the UN. And my contact information is at the end. Thank you very much.
So just to clarify, we'll leave questions until the end of the session where we will have a quick panel discussion. So if you have questions, we can have them at the end. Next, Tom Bauman will present for us. He's the chairman of ISO TC 207 Subcommittee 7. That's the committee at ISO that develops all the climate change standards. Tom's been working on standards for climate change and clean technologies for over 15 years. Tom was the core contributor to the WBCSD WRI GHG protocol for projects and has acted as an advisor to the Climate Disclosure Standards Board, previously also a UNFCCC CDM validator. Tom leads Climate Check, a climate and clean technology consultancy, and has invented and manages Collaborate, the online collaboration platform, which is being used by programs developing and implementing Standards 2.0 systems. Tom is a certified knowledge manager and co-founder of the Greenhouse Gas Management Institute, which has trained thousands of members in over 100 countries. Tom.
Thanks very much, Mike, for that introduction, and thank you everyone for coming to listen to this in-depth discussion about standards, which are not necessarily the most sexy items to tackle climate change, but they are very fundamental. So I'll be presenting a little bit about GHGMI, the code, side event leader, and some of the work that we're doing with the UNFCCC, as well as some of the updates within the ISO system, and then talk about next generation standards. So the Greenhouse Gas Management Institute is a neutral nonprofit entity. It's based out of the United States. Started with one course in 2007, and since then has around 20 or so courses that have been developed across MRV in particular, but also getting into carbon markets and carbon management as well. One of the new flagship series of courses is around the IPCC guidelines. One of my colleagues, actually Michael Gillenwater, who's the executive director of GHGMI here at the front, has been working with the UNFCCC and the expert review teams for 15 years or something like that. And these courses are leading edge, up-to-date online materials, and we're seeing a lot of interest in them. They're just being released in the last few weeks. The courses that have been developed are typically 2 to 5 day courses, so they are quite in-depth, and for the most part are online, but we also do deliver on-site versions when requested. So within the ISO system and my role there, to differentiate the committee I work with, as Mike and Todd had indicated, ISO's an enormous network, 160 plus countries, but there's also hundreds of international organizations that are liaisons that participate in the committees. I believe there's somewhere around 10,000 working groups, and many of those are working on climate change, environment, clean energy standards. Within the committee that I chair, we have 75 countries, and if IED has been approved in the most recent ballot to join our committee, we have 20 international liaisons that participate. There's some listed up on the screen there. So UNFCCC has been a liaison for over 10 years. Likewise with WRI and CDP Gold Standard has recently joined this year as well. So we're growing quite rapidly for response to the demand for more standards within climate change. So who are some of the users of these ISO climate change standards, which are primarily ISO 14064, it's a series of standards, and ISO 14065. There's a few others as well. They've been adopted in at least 40 countries that represent about 80% of global emissions. So it's primarily the large countries, but also developing countries as well. That represents about 20-25% of UNFCCC's membership. The EU ETS, UNFCCC, various national standards bodies where the credit verifiers, and also voluntary programs make use of ISO standards. So I've been chair of this Climate Change Standards Committee for about a year and a half. And over that period of time, we've developed a strategic plan to guide the development of standards going ahead, because we were receiving so many requests to develop new climate change standards. And in order to make best use of our resources and match that with the needs of the marketplace, we went through a very lengthy, engaged process to define what were our priorities over the next few years in terms of mitigation and adaptation standards. And in order to best engage with those communities, particularly in the adaptation community, as Todd had indicated, ISO did not have any adaptation standards per se. And so engaging that community with a well-presented roadmap was critical to onboarding those experts into the ISO process. So similar to the work that was done at the Climate Change Coordinating Committee, which spanned all of ISO's committees, within our specific committee, we also identified adaptation, greenhouse gas management, and then broadly speaking, related to adaptation for enterprises, and also carbon footprinting. And then we were also given feedback by the larger stakeholder community that they would like to participate. Using the online tools was an obvious, low-cost, easy option, and ISO does have these tools, as well as this group here suggests better collaboration across standards development organizations. So ISO itself has been doing a lot of work for transforming itself from the entity that it was created post-World War II, primarily for industry and developing standards on a very rigid basis, to an organization that's starting to take full advantage of online tools. So much like Google Docs or online content management systems for sharing documents, ISO has 100,000 experts in its system, so being able to find the experts, and then using some of the more interesting tools like Web 2.0 wikis for multiple authors, developing working drafts, as well as complementing that with the communications tools that help to explain and translate what the standards are to the standards community, users and organizations. And then in addition, innovating in the space of climate change, the 14,080 standard, which our colleague Shikako Makino from Japan will present in detail to support the larger system of climate change standards. So not just focusing on each methodology, but looking at the larger system, as well as an adaptation suite of standards, which my colleague Ira Feldman will be presenting about next, and then expanding on the strategy and engagement. So moving on now to the next portion of my presentation, what is next generation standard system? What do we mean? What's that vision? Because it can mean different things to different people. One of the hats I wear is to work with the Global Solution Networks, which is an initiative based around digital technologies and multi-stakeholder processes that are very much bottom-up solutions towards some of these needs, such as a global system of standards to complement ISO and other standards bodies. So better standards and better collaboration is the goal of the next generation standard system. So what do we mean? Firstly, how is that standard being developed? Can it be developed in a more agile, participatory approach so that, for example, in the space of adaptation, which is still evolving very rapidly, it needs to be standards development process needs to respond to those changes in order to stay up to date with emerging best practices. How should a standard be structured and be more modularized so that standards that work together can work together better, more interoperable, more compatible, so that we make the most of the standards that have been developed in more complex applications, because many ISO standards are combined in applications. For example, the 14,001 environmental management system standards and many others, social responsibility and so on. In addition to modular design, making standards more of a living document rather than something that is, say, a PDF that's static for 3 or 5 years, and they become more modular design updatable so that they're always up to date with the needs of the marketplace. And then thinking beyond standards development, which is just one phase of it, is looking at the application in terms of knowledge management and the standards users. What do they need? Looking at that system and tightening up all the parts so that it's working much more rapidly than it's ever. So GHGMI is a liaison member to the ISO committee and one of the early adopters of some of these tools. GHGMI became a liaison in order to enable its membership to participate in the standards process. We're able to engage over 100 experts from over 35 countries, roughly 40% of 35 countries, and many of them do not have an ISO member body within our committee. So this was an opportunity to enable their participation, and they provide great value in giving the multi-stakeholder perspective. And just some of the leaders that I've been working with, and I've been sort of an advocate that decarbonization, which is very much trending now, really does depend on deep collaboration and bottom-up participation from experts in order to really enable that to happen within the time we have. Thank you very much.
All right, thanks, Tom. Next up, Ira Feldman will fly through some slides on adaptation. Ira is a US-based sustainability leader with an interdisciplinary skill set and global reach. He has over 25 years' experience as an attorney and management consultant, focusing on environmental regulatory innovation, strategic environmental management, sustainable business practices, and corporate social responsibility. Ira is the climate adaptation lead for the Greenhouse Gas Management Institute and represents GHGMI on ISO TC 207 Subcommittee 7. He chairs the SC7 Adaptation Task Force, which is currently developing a roadmap for ISO climate change adaptation standards. Ira's leadership and work in the climate change adaptation community of practice also includes developing and delivering the graduate level climate change adaptation course at the University of Pennsylvania, establishing Climate Adaptation Scholars LinkedIn group, which currently has over 2,300 members in 160 different countries. And he is also curating over 60 substantive discussion threads, writing and editing e-textbooks on the challenge of climate change adaptation. Thanks, Ira. Go ahead.
When Michael says, I will fly through some slides, that's his subtle way of keeping us on a short leash. Before starting, I do want to thank my colleagues at GHGMI, Michael Gillenwater, Tom Bauman, as well as our good friends at ISO for co-sponsoring this event on the increasingly important topic of standards in the climate change space. For this audience, I don't think it's necessary for me to emphasize some of the basics about mitigation and adaptation, the distinction between mitigation and adaptation, as well as the inextricable linkage between mitigation and adaptation. As Michael ignoring the promise at the outset, what I'm going to do in the next few minutes is a deeper dive into the proposed suite of adaptation standards that may be developed under Subcommittee 7. Again, just to fly through some basics, for those who are not convinced of the importance of the adaptation side of the climate dialogue, even beyond the sheer dollar figures that have been cited by the World Bank and IPCC for addressing climate adaptation. Last year, the World Economic Forum identified the failure of climate change adaptation among the top global risks. Also, it's worth mentioning that despite what Todd and Tom both said, ISO has addressed climate adaptation in a previous standard in ISO 26000 in the environment section of the Corporate Social Responsibility Standard. The environment core topic, I led the drafting team for that, and we attributed co-equal standing for adaptation and mitigation in ISO 26000, reflecting the structure of the international climate dialogue. One quick further point here that informs our efforts in Subcommittee 7 on adaptation standards going forward is the realization that adaptation is very context-specific. One size fits all will just not fly for climate adaptation standards. What works for the private sector does not necessarily work for the public sector. What works in urban areas does not necessarily work in rural areas, and as we'll see, the perspective of the least developed countries is not necessarily the same as the perspective shared with us by representatives of developed countries. We're, of course, operating under ISO rules, and in order to do a good job in entering this new area for SC7, we know that we need to engage with the adaptation community of practice to get a better handle on the adaptation landscape, framework, and priorities. And in order for any standards that are promulgated to be credible and authoritative, we must be informed by the latest work in the field, thus our outreach to a wide range of experts and a diverse group of stakeholders. This slide is basically a mental map of all of SC7's activities. Again, this is the subcommittee that Tom Bauman chairs. What I am talking about, just so you can get an idea of where this is positioned within SC7, is the box on the lower right, the adaptation standards, and next slide will continue to run through this pretty quickly. One thing to point out is that SC7 has had adaptation in its scope since 2008. It is only much more recently, however, that work on adaptation has proceeded in earnest in SC7. An ad hoc group that was formed in May 2014 developed a draft new work item proposal on adaptation, which was presented in Paris at our meeting here in April. That new work item proposal has evolved to the point where it is moving forward as a high-level framework standard for adaptation, one that will set the stage for a suite of context-specific standards. What we also did in April when we met here in Paris was to form the Adaptation Task Force, which I led, to bring together not only internal to ISO participants, but to recruit external to ISO adaptation experts and stakeholders. The Adaptation Task Force was primarily tasked with recommending which types of adaptation standards should be priorities, and we were asked to create both a roadmap and a draft work program. As you'll see from this slide, among the luminaries on the Adaptation Task Force are two members of our panel up here today, both Chicago and Todd were part of the Adaptation Task Force, but significantly, we had representatives from such key organizations as the UNFCCC and the World Bank and UNEP. We had representatives from two major ministries from the US and Canada, and representatives from significant NGOs such as CARE and IISD. So we fielded a survey through the networks of all of those experts, so not just the people who listed, each of them in turn reached out to their networks. And all experts pretty much agreed with what was posited, that adaptation standards need to cut across three categories: planning, implementation, monitoring, evaluation. What also came back from the survey was that we might want to add a pre-planning category that would include, for example, vulnerability assessment slide. To quickly run through each of those three categories again: planning, implementation, monitoring, evaluation. For planning, from a developed country perspective, green infrastructure and resilient cities were priorities this slide. From a developing country perspective, the ranked choices for planning were slightly different: ecosystem-based adaptation, coastal regions, and structural elements for local governments this slide. At the implementation category, the priority sectors that were identified as needing attention were the ones that are listed here: water, food, energy, and transportation. Slide. With respect to the monitoring and evaluation, I'm going very fast, these slides will be available. Monitoring and evaluation, certainly a key concern for World Bank, regional banks, climate finance funds, and development agencies, but we also uncovered through a survey a good deal of confusion between what is meant by monitoring and evaluation and vulnerability assessment, even in professional circles, so we know that some work is needed on the slide. This is maybe the most important slide in the bunch in terms of what's happening in SE7. When combining the perceived need for standards across all those categories, the highest ranking perceived needs were these: vulnerability assessment, monitoring and evaluation at the top and the bottom, and three different specific adaptation planning standards. Next. So what that evolved into was a decision, as of our meeting in New Delhi in September, to move ahead with a high-level framework standard and three additional new work items: one on vulnerability assessment, one on monitoring and evaluation, and one on a specific planning standard to be developed by the proposing country. Next. In my final minute, I just want to build on what Tom had to say about next-generation standard systems, because while this work proceeds in SE7 under ISO, there's a whole wide world, as most of you know, of work going on in the adaptation community in practice. What I've done, as Michael mentioned in my introduction, through the Climate Adaptation Scholars LinkedIn group, we've pulled together on this community of practice over 2,300 experts and stakeholders. What are we going to do with that? We're going to develop a more robust interactive platform of experts, and then we're going to move on and support those experts in an open standard system. So that's the background of Climate Adaptation Scholars, which remains a LinkedIn group functioning today. Next slide. We are going to transition from the LinkedIn platform to a more robust interactive platform that gives us a lot more functionality and the ability to do surveys and convene working groups and get ahead of the curve on ISO and pave the way for future ISO work, importantly. And finally, as Tom articulated, all of this is a specific example of what could be done with an open standard system, resulting in timely standards that better reflect the actual state of play. I think that's my last slide, and I'm happy to follow up with any of you afterwards.
I think because of our neighbors, I feel like we now need a round of applause after our presentation. Thanks, Ira, for flying through the slides. Shikako Makino is next to present. She is the GHG Program Manager of the Japanese Accreditation Board, and she's also serving as a member of ISO's Climate Change Coordination Committee. Ms. Makino has taken leadership roles for climate change adaptation, ISO TC 207, Subcommittee 7, Working Group 7 co-convener, and she's also leading ISO's 14080 with the new standard for guidance with framework and principles for methodologies on climate actions. She serves as the Vice Chair of the Pacific Accreditation Corporation's Technical Committee, and she's the Co-Chair of the Greenhouse Gas and Energy Working Group at the International Accreditation Forum and the Pacific Accreditation Cooperation. She has worked in the area of conformity assessment for over 20 years. At the German Validation and Verification Body, she's developed CDM validation and verification services, and at the Japanese Accreditation Body, she's developed ISO 1465 accreditation programs.
Thank you very much, Mike. I would like to introduce our new standard for climate action today. This standard is quite a new type of standard to link the next generation. As an overview, I will introduce the history and the participation of this standard development and address why the standards are needed and what are the benefits. For panel discussion, I would like to add some view later. Next one, please. So this is a history of and its participation. This standard is proposed in a developing country, Indonesia, and is supported by developed country, Japan. This standard is to support developing country to establish a system of methodology for climate action. But it is also help any country to challenge the consistency, compatibility, comparability. At present, over 50 experts is working together to make this standard. And it is great to have a UNFCCC Secretariat, the World Bank, WRI, Gold Standard, developing and developing countries, and all greenhouse gas mitigation adaptation actors collaborating in this standard to develop. So then we target for publication of this standard in 2017 to 2018. Next one, please. Why 14,080 is needed? Without this standard, there may be high risk of mismatching in the report of aggregated climate actions. Supposedly that connecting various climate action with various methodologies. And a high risk of a serious unproductive counter arguments amongst parties in response to the disclosure of reports on climate action. One thing for sure, that we cannot turn back the time to correct and revise all the data and information contained in the report, when this discrepancy or mismatch are found in the later stage. Loss of time and enormous resources should be prevented. This standard needs to dig out all the possible and justified concern from all greenhouse gas, mitigation and adaptation reactors to discuss and to resolve and come up with good language in this standards as a global consensus. And market expects more transparency and consistency of the standards and methodologies in order to assess and monitor the impact of climate actions and benefit and improve the access and availability of the climate actions. Effective, transparent communication will meet the greenhouse gas program and climate finance needs and requirements. So next one, please. What is 4080? So maybe if you wanted to see the first draft, you can see the back side and that side we prepared WD1. 4080 provides guidance for user. For example, national and global governments, financial institutions, industries, organizations, scheme owners, to establish a framework to guide the process to develop the consistent, comparable, compatible methodology for climate actions. This is for mitigation and adaptation. to identify the best practice and existing methodologies, their selection and application, including reviewing, revision, and maintain management of the methodology. It also provides guidance to design, developing, evaluating new methodologies. This action will improve the quality of the process to make the methodology, and also improve the quality of the process and the resources for application of the methodology, including the framework. Next one, please. This illustrates the role and purpose of the standard. This standard will guide the users to design and implement the framework and the process to manage the methodologies, covering specific process of methodologies to meet policy, strategy, stakeholder expectation, objective, and goals. The standard will provide two steps to select among the existing methodologies and make new methodologies to support system for climate action are credible, consistent, and comparable. For climate finance market, it will support credibility and transparency. Next one, please. So how the 4080 benefits? What is the benefit of this standard? This standard will provide terms and definitions for common understanding of climate action and define steps, thus framework of methodology to set the clear MRV and encourage management of aggregated action and its result. The standards also support to clarify the scope of adaptation and its activities. It's also introduced a common framework to make adaptation and mitigation schemes more compatible and elaborate a different approach of mitigation and adaptation. The standards also support the sustainable development for developed and developing countries in relationship to the mitigation and adaptation. It also supports methodology to assess effectiveness for climate action, national contribution, and a result-based mechanism. It helps financial institutions who wish to determine the financial investment are being used the methodology for effectively to assess the impact of their support of mitigation and adaptation. Then move forward for the next step. So I would, for later panel discussion, I would like to add some view for the voluntary activities. Next one, please. So, this one, please. In Japanese mitigation action, we have two acts, and a voluntary action plan has been implemented for each industries its own target and makes effort to achieve the target. And we have two greenhouse gas program joint crediting mechanisms, so-called GHGM and J credit scheme, in line with 14,064 Part 2 and ISO 14,065 accredited validation verification body work for the validation and verification activity based on the 14,064 Part 3. In addition to this, that Tokyo 2020 Olympic Games will be in accordance with ISO 20,231, Event Sustainability Management System. For adaptation, maybe you know that the Japanese NAP is just approved by the Cabinet on the last Friday, November 27, 2015. To respond to this, as you see in the US presentation, Japan would like to propose a new standard for adaptation planning for local government and monitoring and evaluation. Next one, please. So this is one of the system of the JCM, the project type of greenhouse gas program, to lead local technologies to implement the mitigation action to support the sustainable development of the developing countries. Next one, please. This is also another activity from the Japanese that one of the sector approach, ISO 14,404 defined methodology for calculate energy CO2 intensity in steel plants. To support the steel plants to establish energy management system by combining with technology references. This introduced steel plants diagnosis in developing country to evaluate energy use, to apply for the sustainable energy saving technology, and to help the implementation of energy management systems as well. Next one, please. So this is also bridging. So today I'm talking about bridging standard and bridging countries. So this is a bridging between the mandate and the voluntary activity with accredited verification bodies. And this shows the current status, how globally applied for 14,065 and 14,064 per 3. As the EU ETS mandated for accredited verification in Asian governments, greenhouse gas required for accredited validation verification for project types. And their voluntary global scheme are required 14,065. And it is one of the achievement of Kyoto, that same validation verification process across the mandatory area to voluntary area. Next one, please. So this shows future expectations. IF and ILAC as accreditation body will work together with UNCC, ISO Technical Committee, and ISO Casco, with BIPM and OIML to achieve better credibility and transparency. We will provide a value of a holistic approach with global quality infrastructure, accreditation body, methodology, and standardization to provide confidence for government, trust for stakeholders, and assurance for climate actions. Thank you very much. And if you wanted to download it for 14,080 as a WD1, you can click on that. And if you really wanted to see the paper, you can get on the back of the room. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, Chicago. Next up is Joe Maddon. Joe Maddon is the CEO and co-founder of EOS Climate. As an experienced entrepreneur in the clean economy, Joe has founded EOS Environment and is an environment to triplepundit.com. Joe has driven innovation in technology, industry, policy, and environmental markets, and has delivered market-based solutions for pressing environmental challenges. Joe is regularly featured in the press on sustainability and environmental markets. EOS Climate is an award-winning innovator in carbon markets. This unique experience enabled EOS to identify broader opportunities to address climate change on a global scale by harnessing the power of capital markets to address climate change. EOS's unique experience in creating scalable emission reductions in new environmental markets provided the foundation for the CIF concept.
Yeah, please.
First off, thanks very much for allowing a market perspective here. It's a testament to the collaborative spirit of the standards approach that we're discussing here today. I also want to thank American Carbon Registry and John Kowalczewski. John couldn't be here today, so I'll do my best to represent his portion of the presentation. And I've got 9 minutes here, and we're going to talk about some very big concepts. So I'd ask everybody to sort of stretch your mind open. If I've been reminded many times by Tom Bowden that I'm free and loose with the way that I speak, and sometimes my words are trigger responses from a standard perspective. But just if we can keep things conceptual, that would be appreciated. So I'm with EOS Climate, and we're based in San Francisco. We operate in the California cap-and-trade system. We've generated 2 different ISO 1464 methodologies, and we're a market leader in that market. I think what's most relevant for this presentation is the fact that the project types that we've developed are considered scalable, and in reality, as a person that's been in this market, it's very difficult to scale given the constraints. And I think one of the key things here is that the project types that we've generated are production focused as opposed to project based, and I think that underlies a lot of the insights that we're talking about here today. So, and behind all of this, I think a really important fact I want to address here is, in addition to the momentum associated with carbon pricing at this national and subnational level, capital markets are now recognizing carbon risk as a material risk. And that stems from the point of view of the institutional investors who are requesting the information. Companies are providing the information, and markets are now reacting to that. So they're reacting in the form of moving capital away from carbon-intense assets and towards carbon-efficient assets. So you can see that in the form of products, exchange-traded funds that markets are developing, and also in indices to identify low-carbon opportunities in the markets. So, and I want to make a distinction here between the capital markets themselves and regulated carbon markets. First, capital markets are global. They exist today and they're global. Second, they are driven not by political measures or political will, they're driven by profit. That's their main driver. From a time perspective, they generally look towards the future, not the past, as in a compliance framework. Did you comply or not comply? Likewise, they compare things better or worse on a relative basis, as opposed to did someone comply or not comply. And from a modality, they're very, very dynamic. They take into account an incredible amount of factors and constantly refine their outlook. I don't want to say that regulated carbon markets are not dynamic. They're just less so than the capital markets in general. And when we look at capital markets, there's some very low-hanging fruit with regards to carbon mitigation. The commodity markets in general, they trade assets that are undifferentiated. And very, all corn trades, I shouldn't say all corn, it would be certain types of corn trade on par with certain kinds of corn with no consideration for the impacts associated with that corn. And so if we look here, the graph on the left, you have, this is a graph representing the aggregate impact on a per barrel basis for oil. And on the left, you can see that the oil from the field on the left is about 80% more greenhouse gas intensive than the oil on the right. Yet, in general, oil trades on the market without any consideration for the greenhouse gas impacts associated with it. The interesting thing is this graph can apply to, or similar graphs can be made for palm oil or rice or soybeans or different metals or natural gas. They're not, the greenhouse gas impacts and many of the other externalities are not considered by the commodity markets. So when we think about where standards could go, this, to me, is the biggest opportunity for standards themselves in enabling the markets to differentiate materials by impact. So what we're talking about now, then, is we're talking about information flowing to markets. Markets value assets in general that can be delivered on a physical basis. Oil can be delivered, palm oil can be delivered, and you can actually take physical delivery. But what we're talking about here is delivering information to the market so that they can make decisions. And integrity is critical, and being associated with greenhouse gas emission reductions in regulated markets, I can say that in general, we're very effective at delivering emission reductions with a high degree of integrity. I can also say that the current process does not scale in any way, shape, or form. So if we're going to be successful at delivering information to markets with integrity, that has integrity at scale, something different is going to have to happen than has happened previously. And so I think the key thing here is that technology now exists and it's leveraged by all kinds of different industries in all kinds of different ways. I think the standards can can do well to deploy some of the different technologies. Mobile technology, for example, can aggregate and verify data. The blockchain can act as a global registry, so it prevents double counting and ensures integrity of information. It can also allow for the allocation of capital across international boundaries. And I can say from a project development standpoint, the timing of capital associated with project development is critical. Big data analytics, secondary data sets can be used to verify data that's reported. And we've talked about today, global solution networks can be used to create globally accepted standards and also update those standards on an ongoing basis. So in practice, we'll take a generic example of how we might get this done. But if we develop a globally accepted standard in a sector that quantifies or creates a methodology to quantify impact and outlines the verification process, and we apply that standard to pre-qualify producers in a given sector, and then utilize secondary data to verify the information that they report, and place the metrics onto a blockchain format so that it can be delivered to the market can then include that data in its decision making. So back to our example, a very, very simple example here is if markets get information that's relevant and that is valued in the marketplace, and we're saying that carbon risk is now a value in the marketplace. Going back to our graph, the barrel on the left represents the higher greenhouse gas intensity oil, and the barrel on the right represents the lower greenhouse gas intensity. So market participants will then begin to value and price in the value of that externalities associated with the underlying asset. So we went through a very big concept in a very short period of time, but we did do some quite a bit of work on this, almost part of it. And if you'd like to find out more information on our approach here, you can go to sifsystem.com. So thank you very much. Look forward to the rest of the conversation.
Thanks, Joe. So for our last presentation today, before we're able to maybe squeeze in a short panel discussion, I want to introduce Owen Hewlett. Owen's the Chief Technology Officer at the Gold Standard Foundation. The Gold Standard Foundation is a standards development and certification body in climate mitigation and also sustainable development. They're currently developing the Gold Standard version 3 standard as a next generation standard for mitigation. The Gold Standard is a liaison member of TC207, SE7, and is also building assurance around the ISO standards. So we're happy to have Owen here to present on this.
Hi everyone, glad to be here today. Thanks to ISO and GHGMI for lending us their stage. My name is Owen Hewlett, I'm the Chief Technical Officer at the Gold Standard Foundation, and we're developing, I guess, what could be described as a next generation standard. So I'll explain a little bit about who we are and what we do and what's involved in that standard before rounding off with some sort of observations and lessons learned about what we've discovered along that journey. So in terms of who the Gold Standard is, we were founded in 2003 by WWF, really as a best practice labelling mechanism for the CDM, so best practice in terms of sustainable development contribution and stakeholder inclusivity. And today we still focus on inclusivity, holistic safeguards and sustainable development contribution. We're now at around 1,100 activities on our portfolio, 350 of which are CDM labelling activities. So we've really outgrown our initial remit. We currently operate across 3 scopes. What's the trouble hearing? Can everybody else hear? Yeah. We currently operate across 3 scopes: land use, energy, and water. And as Mike introduced, we're a liaison member for the Environmental Standards Subcommittee, as well as an applicant member for the Clean Cooking Technical Committee. We really build our assurance approach around ISO 17065 and ISO 14065, and we're a GVAC member of the American National Standards Institute. I'm really excited to see the developments around ISO 14018 really accords with our approach. So this year we appointed a new CEO, Marion Vale, who in town this week, and we undertook a pretty deep strategic review. Turned over a lot of stones and really committed ourselves to continuing the fight for holistic design and stakeholder inclusivity in our projects. So our new vision, climate security and sustainable development for all, really speaks to that. We also committed to continuing in the sorry, my slides have a mind of their own. So we committed to So we really committed to continue in the standards and certification space as key tools to that agenda, and the result really is our current development of Gold Standard version 3, which we hope to launch next year. In terms of our theory of change, there are really 2 key parts to that. On the project side, we provide the framework for best practice development of activities, the tools to quantify real and credible impacts, and then the products for results-based finance mechanisms to help people monetize those. And then we take that information and we really use it to advocate and inspire for change in regulation and approaches, and also to identify new sources of finance and drive that towards good activities. Why are we building a next generation standard? Well, it's pretty clear that right now we sit at the intersection of 2 pretty significant global agendas, hopefully seminal global agendas. We feel strongly that these are not mutually exclusive agendas, they're really part of the same fight. And there's a real clear need for holistic thinking in this space. And we also felt that we've learned a lot over the last 12 or 13 years in the carbon markets and have the tools and the knowledge and the experience to really apply it in this new global agenda. There are some more prosaic reasons for GSV3. One is that we wanted to rationalise those 3 existing scopes and into one single standard, and to really update some of our modules to latest best practice. We want to make the best of the carbon markets, so the methodological approach to quantification of impacts we strongly believe can be applied to the Sustainable Development Goals. On that, we also want to move the conversation on from carbon and co-benefits to something more holistic. We really want to create clarity of claim, so the transparency of what you can say about a carbon credit or any other product and what it can be used for as terms of jurisdiction. With those things in mind, I believe we can pioneer new results-based finance mechanisms built around a framework of the Sustainable Development Goals. So we also feel strongly that the SDGs have gathered a global momentum, the conversation is moving, and there's a real kind of getting behind that. And then lastly, we have 1,100 activities. That's a complicated beast, so we want to make it easy as possible to use. But we also want to try and mine some of that information. You can imagine the 250 cook stove activities that we have. There's some really fascinating information that we can draw out of that. We can set ourselves right. Just in terms of what Gold Standard version 3 is, so we really built a standard for activities and impacts that's built around the nexus, as we call it, of energy, land use and water. So really speaking to our current scopes and our history, but not really looking at those as separate items. It's a very rational and flexible standard, and that allows us to recognise and acknowledge other standards, tools and methodologies that are out there, so very much acting as a meta-standard, where we act as a framework, but other tools such as the ISO tools can fit within it, and we can fit within theirs. And it really sets the tone for pioneering new results-based finance mechanisms. So probably enough on the theory side. So in terms of what the structure of Gold Standard version 3 is, I was interested to hear Tom and Chicago mention this kind of modular approach to standard building, and that's really accords with what we've tried to achieve. So there are really 3 key building blocks to Gold Standard version 3, and the idea is somebody would work through those layers and build up the picture of their activity. It really works left to right, so Building block 1 there on the left will be our general activity principles, so safeguarding principles, sustainable development contribution, stakeholder inclusivity. Really applies to all activities, be it a forest or a wind farm. Then building block 2 would be activity quantification methodologies linked to the SDGs. So the idea there is that people will be able to layer up their activity, adding more and more impact methodologies as is appropriate to them. And then lastly, the right-hand side of the equation is where those impact methodologies convert into results-based finance mechanisms. And here we really want to be as flexible as possible. So keeping with our carbon credit history, but also offering a range of products that potentially goes from simple certified statements of outcomes through to something more complex with a legal jurisdiction and a compliance claim. That's probably a little bit easier to visualise with an example. So imagine an agriculture activity that's really around water efficient cropping or drip irrigation and some energy efficiency measures within that. That activity would come through the gold standard gateway on the left hand side, so building block 1, and apply all of our standard tools for activity, safeguards, stakeholder engagement, SD contribution, certification. It would then have a range of activity-based methodologies for the quantification of SDG impacts. So here I've given some examples around SDG 13, particularly pertinent this week, amongst others. And it's important here where the meta standard framework comes in, is that it's very possible to acknowledge and recognise other people's methodologies within that framework. And then lastly, those impact methodologies can go on and issue different types of products. So here we've got some examples of certified outcome statements, or going on to something like a gold standard carbon credit. I chose this example because it highlights some interesting new dynamics that we've come to acknowledge. This is a bit of an animation, so I'll just run it to its conclusion and then freeze it. Lose control of my own presentation. So there's really two new aspects to this. One is how to deal with trade-offs and compromise within the standard, and the other is how to enhance and include stakeholders even better than we have before. So inherent within the climate change agenda is compromise. There are trade-offs. For us, in the intersection of the environmental nexus, there are trade-offs between water supply and energy, or land use and water. These are kind of expected adverse outcomes, so they're not really risks anymore. They're stuff that you know if you're going to conserve water, you may well have to use energy and create emissions to do that. So how can a standard deal with expected adverse outcomes, those trade-offs? So here we see that this worthy agricultural activity, I think we all agree that's generally a good agricultural activity. Well, to save that water, energy is used. And although the water saved really benefits the farmer, and yes, he's using less water, actually the removal of that kind of flood irrigation takes away some of the water for downstream users. So how do we deal with that? Well, we've come up with a kind of three-spoke approach. One is to create a series of nexus assessments that allows you to understand the conditional requirements. When is it okay for this activity to create an amount of emissions? When is it okay to use water? We also enhanced our stakeholder guidelines to move from local stakeholder consultations towards affected stakeholder consultations. And I think this example is nice because you can see that some of those affected stakeholders could be 100 miles away, not just local to the activity. And then lastly, we're building a framework around contextual mitigation. So it might be that this activity can't do much to reduce those expected adverse outcomes, but within the landscape can offer other mitigation activities, such as offsetting within the landscape or further water efficiency downstream. This logically extends to one step further. So what about trade-offs that aren't within the standard? So a good example of that would be energy reliability. What about safeguards states that if you are an activity that uses energy that supplies the local grid, well, you shouldn't reduce that supply or the reliability of it to other users. And what about an example where that community says, well, actually, we'd happily give all that up for a more efficient mill that saves us from backbreaking work? How do we allow for that kind of trade-off? We certainly don't want a standard that has every possible connotation of trade-off. You just never write that, thousands of pages long. So what we're creating is a mechanism for legitimate stakeholder decision-making. So in the context of that example, the legitimate stakeholder community group that comes together and democratically decides that yes, we'd accept lower reliability to save us from this backbreaking work. Well, there's a mechanism now for that. Disappeared. So I've come to the end of that example anyway, as it happens, so not such a bad thing. There's a few observations that we've learned along the way in developing Gold Standard version 3 that are hopefully quite interesting. think, as Tom Chikaka mentioned, the modular approach was very important. We took a real deep look at ourselves and what is the DNA of gold standard, what are the building blocks that really make it up, and really rationalise what's activity side, so what's the stuff that applies to activities, and then what's impact side, so the stuff that is really around impacts, not about the activity itself. And then lastly, what's product related. So in our former lives, we had a cook stove emissions reduction carbon credit standard. All of those elements rolled into one. Now what we have is an activity module, an impact module, and a carbon credit module. All of those things separable and building up a picture really to help that activity. We learned and acknowledged really that, and I think we all need to do this, is that there are trade-offs in our agenda. If you want to save emissions, there are payoffs to that. If you want to develop land use, there are payoffs to that that need to be acknowledged and dealt with. And then we've looked long and hard at assurance. How does certification fit within that context? If you want a flexible standard, how is certification going to react to that? So for us, there's a huge now range of activity types and impact types. So that's one challenge. Another challenge is we're looking at some activities which are marginal change and some which are transformational change. So really looking at the scale of a city through to the scale of a cook stove. How can certification react to that? And then lastly, the sort of global challenge for certification is how can we make it cheaper and easier to actually do? So becoming a pretty big challenge, I think. The flip side of next generation standards is probably next generation certification. What are the building blocks of certification? How can we make it standard? And then lastly, just to kind of wrap up, something that's really close to our hearts at Gold Standard is the stakeholder engagement element. So we have spent a long time building sustainable development contributions and safeguards. Really our heartland territory is to improve and engage with stakeholders. So how can we move the agenda and next generation standards through to effective stakeholder engagement and consultation, and then to take it one step further and allow that democratic, legitimate decision making from stakeholders to generate activities that are allowed to make trade-offs. So I think I'll just sign off by saying it's quite an exciting time, I'd say, in standards, just because we're really looking now at not necessarily black and white decision making, not necessarily binary conditionality within a standard, really allowing to standardise difficult decision making. I think if standards can do that, then I think it's really kind of a change really. So just in terms of next steps, we're launching that standard for public consultation in January, and we're generally around for the next 2 weeks, and I'd love to hear sort of thoughts and comments, if anyone has any questions, obviously we'll comment now and after. Thanks for letting me say.
Thanks, Owen, and apologies for the technical difficulties. We heard that it was crashing earlier and it's crashed again, but now it's back again. So we'd like to have just a quick facilitation of a panel and some questions with the group. To do so, I'm going to introduce Nick Blythe. Nick Blythe is the Policy Engagement Lead at IEMA. IEMA is the Institute of Environmental Management and Assessment, which is headed out of the UK. It's a global body, professional body, that has over 15,000 members, and they specialize in environmental and sustainability professions. Nick is also a member of the Climate Change Coordination Committee at ISO. So Nick, if you wouldn't mind.
Okay, thank you, Michael. Okay, so not long to go now, just 5 to 10 minutes. We'll have a bit of Q&A for the panel here. Thank you for that introduction, Michael. I just think standards work, of course, feels like an incredibly dry area of work, but there's some really visionary stuff going on through these presentations. And I think we just need to explore that a little bit in this Q&A session, so let's take that forward. I'll ask you some questions in a minute. I'm just going to ask one, if you bear with me. First of all, it's an open one. Probably mostly to Tom, but if anybody else can pick up on this as well, please feel free. So the whole approach to next generation standards and a more nimble, or more footloose approach to standards making feels like a good development. Our members often are quite critical about how long some standards take to develop, but that's done for good reason, collaboration and good consensus building. But then you end up with more than one standard on a similar issue, maybe a more fast and nimble approach to standards with collaboration and involving more parties feels like a very, very sensible approach moving forward. So Tom, I suppose one quick question, if you could give an example of that kind of next generation approach that we're talking about to standards making, and also roll into that if you could describe some of the challenges you think that faces that approach.
Thanks very much, Nick.
Well, in terms of an example of next generation standards leader, I showed on my last slide, ICROA, the International Carbon Reduction and Offsetting Alliance, which is a part of IETA, the International Oceans Trading Association. They have a code of best practice, i.e. a standard by which all of their organizations abide by to demonstrate that they are quality organizations doing offsetting, so that it's a trust label and standard. In addition to supporting the candidate, in addition, is that because of the too loud there? Okay. So that's much better. So in addition to helping them to continue to update their standard, because it is a continuous improvement process, their members have also migrated to online standards application and auditing to enable them to reduce those steps in the overall life cycle of a standard. So you develop it, you go through a consultation education process, you apply it, there's the review, there's the learnings, and then in that process they're able to extract, sort of in a big data way, what were the best practices, what were the opportunities for improvement, so that they could then quickly update their code of best practice so that they're able to shorten the overall cycle in a way that is all clearly transparent from use of the standard. So that's one example of shortening the cycle that it takes within the life cycle of a standard, if you can think of it in those terms. In terms of some of the challenges, it's moving from the fragmented approach where standards development is often separate from the standards use and the lessons learned, and so educating the participants to think more holistically about the standard system and to have a collaboration strategy when you get to mass collaboration on developing standards and with stakeholder engagement. It is a different approach than what has been followed for the last several decades. And so going through essentially a knowledge audit, who knows who needs what kind of tools to best perform their duties, educating people on this new way of collaborating is perhaps the biggest challenge. We have great tools, and bringing it all together is the challenge that I'm concerned with. So.
Tom, thank you very much. It certainly feels very, very different, and completely different approach to locking people away in rooms for 2 years and then surprising the world with a standard 2 years down the line. You're getting much more ownership and engagement in the process as you go. So really, really quite interesting stuff. Quite a challenge, I should imagine. Anybody else on the panel want to comment on that generality before I take one or two questions? A bit short on time. Are there any questions for the panel at all? So we've got two. Can I take two together and then put them both? I'll frame them back. I don't know if we've got a mic, so could you... Okay. Would you like to just, ask a question? Oh, sorry. There's a mic coming actually. Apologies, thank you.
Okay, my name is Ingo Pohl from the Salzburg Group. I have a question. Most innovation, and I think these next generation standards, represent that, are driven by demand pull, by need, right? I would like to have short statements on where you see the demand pull for the innovation and standards that you have done. I would be interested in everybody's opinion, but specifically Joe's of yours capital and the gold standard. Where the demand pull for what you're doing coming from.
Okay, thank you.
I'm Jeff McMahon from Forbes. The subhead of the panel is making the INDCs real. I'm just curious whether the INDCs being voluntary creates any challenges for standard making. Voluntary and therefore potentially different in each nation.
So, two questions there to summarise. One was about the very specific one about where the demand is coming from the different directions for these standards developments. And then this further question here about the voluntary nature, yeah, the INDC. Okay. Who would like to have a go on either of those 2 points and come back first of all to Joe? Right, yeah.
So the demand side is actually coming in the capital markets is coming from the institutional investors themselves. So starting with stranded assets, that basically was a wake-up call to the capital markets. Once institutional investors started recognizing that carbon was risk in easily identified coal stocks, for example. But then as soon as you acknowledge that carbon is a risk in that fashion, you get much more sophisticated. So you can see quickly they've started to generate analytical tools and so forth. I think on the other side, which I think relates a lot to I wanted to speak the companies themselves face a lot of risk in particularly at the bottom of their base of their supply chain. So a recent beyond carbon risk was issues that Costco faced with slave labor involved with their shrimp production, for example. And so I think some of the things that Gold Standard is doing in that holistic approach, those are two different risks that exist in the marketplace, and there are not very many tools today to address that.
Thanks, Jim. So, I mean, just to flip around the question first, from our perspective, what we do is create something flexible enough that wherever the demand is, you can get. You know?
Can we just have the mic up a bit, please, technical guys?
So we really want to flip around that first and say, well, look, we need to get finance to these activities, wherever that finance is coming from. So one of the rationales for B3 is to be flexible enough to experiment with different results-based finance markets. And from our perspective, and I think this kind of touches on the second question, is that the voluntary markets can experiment, they can pioneer, and they are allowed to fail much more so than compliance markets. It's okay for us to try something and not really work, and then try something else and see if we can keep doing that. But then in terms of more specific demand questions, where we're not by any stretch moving away from our carbon heartland that we fully expect. Although the messaging and the claims of that market may change, we fully expect that to continue. And it's clear within that market there is still this co-benefits demand side. And although we don't necessarily agree with that dialogue, there is a demand there. And so I feel like we can help shape that. So there's the existing carbon markets. But then as Joe said, there are lots of other results-based finance players like institutional investors, corporate CSR programs, corporate risk management, that kind of thing, that could all use this flexible mechanism for their own devices without necessarily knocking the whole thing over. So there's lots of specific examples, but I guess the message from our side is create something flexible enough to move into whatever market best supports it the most.
Well, thanks guys for that. That's great. I think we're running short of time now. I don't know if we've quite answered the INDC question, but we'll perhaps catch up with one or two from the panel afterwards if need be on that. So I think we're done for time. I'm just going to hand back to Michael here.
So I guess just in conclusion, I think there's people coming in and everyone has to go. I wanted to conclude and thank everyone for coming today. I think there's a lot of opportunity for standards. They do help fill a gap that exists. And lastly, just to flag and highlight that ISO welcomes everyone's participation. Within each country, there is a member body, and you can participate directly in the ISO development process. So I'd absolutely encourage everyone to get involved and sit around the table and help to develop the next generation of standards. So thank you again for coming today. I really appreciate it. If we can just give a round to the panel.